Before we begin, Galactic Horrors is now on Patreon. Get daily stories in one place, with no ads and no interruptions. Link is in the description or search Galactic Horrors on Patreon. Now, let's begin the transmission. The distress signal was 6 days old by the time I cleared the approach vector. 6 days of silence followed a single automated burst. Seismic event, possible structural compromise, request immediate assessment. Written in standard language under a standard priority code. Garfield Mineral Corp sent calls like this to contractors like me twice a year when one of their outer belt sites hiccuped and nobody wanted to spend the fuel on a full team before someone cheaper assessed the damage. I ran through my pre-dock checklist aboard the Harlan, my service shuttle, while the colony's docking array pinged back clean confirmations for Dan Holt, contract operator, Emergency Response Division. In 9 years of this work, I'd walked into collapsed bore shafts on Callisto, cleared wreckage from a centrifuge failure on Maddox Station, and once spent 11 days cutting a frozen drill assembly out of a thermal pocket on an asteroid so small the company hadn't bothered to name it. The pay was good because the work was ugly, while most people wanted a partner and a split contract fee. I worked alone. Prospect 9 was a mid-grade extraction colony with 31 crew at full complement. Garfield had sunk a geothermal tap into the asteroid's thermal core to run the place, cheaper than shipping reactor fuel to the outer belt. They'd been pulling nickel iron ore for about 14 months when the deep-bore team pushed past their original survey depth chasing a richer thermal gradient. According to the operational logs I'd pulled during transit, that happened 6 weeks ago. The distress ping followed 6 days ago, then silence. The docking clamps caught the Harlan with a clean magnetic seal. Bay pressure nominal. Lights on. The colony's power grid was active across the board. That was the first thing that didn't fit. A seismic event strong enough to trigger an automated distress signal should have knocked something loose. Fractured conduit lines, blown breakers, pressure loss in at least one section. I'd seen it a dozen times, but Prospect 9's board showed full power across all levels, atmosphere cycling normally, geothermal output at 93%. If this colony had taken a seismic hit, it had shaken it off without losing a single light fixture. I suited up in the docking bay's staging area. My engineering armor was rated for impact, thermal exposure and short-duration vacuum, heavy plating over a thermal underlayer, powered joints at the knees and elbows, a helmet with a heads-up display, and integrated comm. The tools of my trade hung on a hardpoint rig across my back. A manual hydraulic cutter with enough jaw pressure to bite through a 4-inch conduit, and a manual pry bar I could use to crack sealed access panels or lever wreckage. I was an engineer, equipped with tools that cut metal instead of weapons. The airlock cycled, and I stepped into Prospect 9. The first level was crew quarters and colony operations. I walked through a corridor cut from raw asteroid rock, walls reinforced with steel plating and lined with power conduit runs that fed the overhead lighting and the ventilation system. Open doorways revealed bunks and lockers, while a common area held coffee mugs on the table and a deck of cards fanned out mid-game. The rooms were empty and structurally intact, their occupants gone without any indication of a hurried departure or destination. My jaw hurt. A dull pressure behind my lower molars, the kind I associated with pressure equalization after a long shuttle run. I worked my jaw side to side and moved on. The freight elevator took me down to the working levels. I found the first one in the primary equipment bay. He was a drill operator, or he had been. A standing rock drill occupied the center of the bay, a 10-foot vertical assembly built to bore pilot holes into the ore face. The drill was still running, its rotary bit turning in a slow, grinding cycle. The man's arms had been fed into the mechanism. His bones had been broken at the forearms and re-angled to follow the spiral path of the drill shaft, threaded through the rotary housing like cable through a conduit chase. His torso was pulled flush against the drill's outer casing. Where his skin met the machine's surface, blackened marks traced the paths of electrical current, burn patterns that mapped the contact points between his body and the drill's wiring. His fingers were still moving, twitching in the rotation, curling and uncurling in time with the drill's cycle. I stood there for a long time, looking at the way his forearms corkscrewed into the housing. Then I opened my suit log and recorded an industrial accident. A catastrophic equipment failure during the seismic event. That was the account I gave the log and myself. These things happened in asteroid mining. A man gets pulled into a machine and the machine keeps running. Gruesome, but it had a file category and a form. I moved deeper into the working level. The second one was on the ore conveyor line. A man lay lengthwise along the drive chain's upper run, his ribcage spread open around the sprocket assembly at the conveyor's head. The chain ran through him. His spine had been pulled forward and curved around the sprocket's teeth, vertebrae seated in the chain's link gaps like components placed by hand. The running conveyor carried him with its cycling chain, drawing his body along its length and around the sprocket in a slow, continuous loop. The third one was what broke it. A technician occupied a junction room beside an open power distribution panel, a standard waist-high breaker box with a hinged cover. His hands were inside the panel, fingers threaded into the circuit board tracks, pushed between the copper traces and the substrate until his fingertips had penetrated the board itself. His palms were flat against the panel's contact points. His face was pressed to the housing above the panel, cheek sealed to the metal by a wide, ragged burn. I surveyed the 4-meter square room. The junction panel stood on the far wall, with open floor stretching between it and the door. The man had crossed that floor, opened the cover, and pushed his hands into the wiring before pressing his face to the housing. The open floor, raised cover, and his position formed a deliberate path to the panel. He did it to himself. I tried the colony's internal comm from a working terminal near the junction room and cycled through every channel, receiving no reply. I pulled up the colony's operational network instead. The crew manifest loaded. 31 names, 31 biosignal transponders built into their worksuits. The system showed 30 active signals clustered at fixed positions on the lower levels, each corresponding to a heavy equipment station and marking an integration point. The people who had done this to themselves were still alive inside the machines, and the colony's system was still reading their vitals. One biosignal transponder was absent from the network, a status the system distinguished from a recorded death. The transponder might have been destroyed. Its wearer might have left the colony or entered an area beyond the network's reach. My contract required me to locate survivors, including that missing crew member. The densest cluster of active signals was below me, on the lower processing levels and down near the deep bore shaft and the geothermal plant, but the absent signal could be anywhere. I descended. The ore processing gallery was a wide, low-ceilinged chamber filled with the colony's heavy extraction line, rock crushers, sorting conveyors, chemical separation tanks, all of it bolted to the floor and fed by conduit runs as thick as my forearm. Constructs occupied the running machines. A crusher operator fused into the jaw assembly of a primary crusher, his shoulders wedged between the fixed and moving plates, his arms wrapped around the toggle mechanism. 2 sorters woven through a conveyor's guide rail system, their torsos threaded between the rollers. Every machine was live, every construct was integrated into a piece of powered equipment. I picked my way through the gallery. The spacing between machines was tight. The layout was designed for ore flow, not foot traffic. I passed within arm's reach of constructs whose hands still gripped drive shafts, whose legs were tangled in chain assemblies. The current running through them was visible in small ways. A twitch of a finger, a spasm in a forearm, the slow, involuntary curl of a foot around a conduit bracket. On the far side of the gallery, I found a corridor where the lights were dead. The power conduits along the walls had been severed with something small and sharp, a utility blade or wire cutter, and their copper ends carefully capped with insulating tape. Every conduit in the corridor was dead, every junction box disconnected. The corridor was dark except for the chemical glow strip on my shoulder rig. At the end of the corridor, a sealed equipment locker. Heavy door, manual latch. I heard 3 deliberate knocks from inside, a pause, then 3 more. A human signal. I opened the latch. The man inside was sitting against the back wall with a suit air tank propped between his knees and a hydration bladder that looked close to empty. He flinched when the light hit him and threw up a hand to block it. His left hand. The right was wrapped in a crude bandage torn from a suit liner, and the shape under the wrapping was wrong, too narrow, missing volume along the outer edge. "Garfield response," he said. "Contract operator, Dan Holt. Lou Kemper, shift supervisor." He lowered his hand and squinted at me. 46, maybe older. 5 days of beard growth and the hollowed look of someone who hadn't eaten in most of that time. "You alone?" "Solo contract. They sent one guy. They sent a damage assessment. I'm what that looks like." Lou looked past me into the dark corridor. "How many of them did you pass?" "Enough to know this isn't a seismic event." His almost laugh came out as a short, dry sound. "You're right. This is no seismic event," he told me in fragments. Dehydrated and shaken, Lou backtracked and repeated himself as he forced the story aloud after days alone with it, but the core was clear. 6 days ago, the deep bore team broke through into a subsurface cavity below the bore's terminal point. Afterward, the geothermal circulation pumps, which ran 24 hours to keep the colony's power grid fed, took on a different vibration. It came up through the rock itself, through the metal infrastructure, through every conduit and beam and floor plate in the colony. Within hours, people started moving wrong, their hands drifting toward equipment without intent as men stood near power conduits in confusion and then walked toward them. The first full integration happened in the drill gallery, when a bore operator walked into the drill's rotation and kept going. It took his arms first, and then his chest, and he didn't fight it. "You need to understand that the force is physical," Lou said. "Your body moves on its own as your muscles fire, your joints turn, and your hands reach for the nearest live current while you remain aware of everything and cannot stop it." "How long before it takes?" "It depends where you are. Near the surface, on the docking levels, it's a tug in your hands. Down here, on the processing levels, it's strong enough to override you during a peak." "What do you mean by peaks?" "It cycles, building to a crest before dropping back. You get maybe 2 quiet minutes to move, think and fight it, followed by a 40-second peak when—" He held up his bandaged right hand and unwound the wrapping with his teeth and left hand. The ring finger and small finger were gone below the second knuckle. The stumps were cauterized, burned shut with something hot, probably a soldering iron from the equipment locker. "My hand went for the conduit during a peak," he said. "I pulled it back, but my fingers had already made contact and the current had started the fusion. I could feel my skin bonding to the terminal, so I cut them off with my utility knife before it spread past the first knuckle." He wrapped the hand again. "Then I cut every conduit in this corridor, sealed the door, and stayed in the dark." I looked at the dead corridor around us, stripped of power, current, and integration targets. "How do we stop it?" "Kill the geothermal plant. The pumps drive it. Their vibration feeds through that cavity the crew dug into, and the cavity turns it into whatever this is, this frequency. Shut down the pumps, cut the power grid, and the whole thing goes silent." "You tried the master trip." "I tried 3 times from operations. The first command came back rejected, while the next 2 registered and then cleared themselves before the breakers opened. The emergency shutdown at the processing board gave me the same result because the controls say the pumps are under local maintenance authority." "At the hub?" Lou nodded. "Something down there is keeping them online. The only circuits I've managed to kill are the ones I cut all the way through. The transponders say 30 of the crew are still alive. What happens to them when the plant stops?" His left thumb worked across the edge of his bandage, pressing the loose end flat. "After integration, the signals settled into a pattern where heart rate and respiration rose and fell with the equipment cycles." "That wasn't my question." "I don't know." He looked toward the powered gallery beyond the dead corridor. "If the machines are keeping them alive, shutting down might kill them." If you leave the pumps running, they'll keep cutting. The active signals I had seen on the terminal had been fixed at workstations for 6 days. 30 survivors, if a body threaded through a drive assembly still counted as a survivor. My contract said locate them. It did not tell me what to do when saving the colony and keeping its crew alive had become 2 different jobs. The geothermal hub is at the bottom of the deep bore shaft. That's right. How strong is the frequency down there? Lou hesitated just long enough for me to catch it. Stronger than up here, but you can make it if you time your movement through the troughs. You could come with me. He looked at his hand. I'm down 2 fingers and I haven't eaten in 5 days. I'd slow you down until you ended up dragging me. So get to the hub and kill the pumps. I'll be here when you come back. There was something in the way he said it, too rehearsed, the logic too neatly stacked. I had neither a competing theory nor time to argue with a man who'd cut off his own fingers to stay alive. Lou Kemper wanted me to go down to the geothermal hub and kill the power grid, which was also the only plan I had. I left him in the dark. The freight elevator shaft dropped from the processing level through 200 meters of rock to the mid-level ore transport galleries. I took the elevator because the alternative was a maintenance ladder bolted to the shaft wall, and I wasn't ready to climb 200 meters down in full armor. The elevator was a steel cage on a powered rail. Conduit runs lined the shaft walls, feeding power to the lower levels. The cage itself drew current from a contact strip on the rail. I was standing inside a box made of metal, surrounded by live wiring, descending toward a place where the thing in the rock was stronger. 40 seconds into the descent, the frequency peaked. The frequency bypassed my ears and took control of my body. My arms lifted from my sides without permission. My hands rotated, palms out, and pressed flat against the cage wall. My fingers spread toward the power feed bracket mounted 6 inches from my right hand. The joints extended until my tendons ached, reaching for the current in the bracket. I grabbed my right wrist with my left hand and pulled. My right arm resisted. The muscles in my forearm were contracted hard, locked in extension, fighting me. I wedged myself into the corner of the cage and pinned my arms between my knees, folding at the waist, forcing my hands down and away from the walls. My shoulders burned from the effort of overriding what my own motor neurons were demanding. After about 40 seconds, the peak broke and my muscles went slack. I stayed folded in the corner, breathing hard, fingers tingling. The pain in my jaw had migrated down into my collarbones and across my shoulder blades. The whole skeleton of me was a tuning fork that something kept striking. The elevator hit the mid-level, and I stepped out into the ore transport corridor. Rail system. Ore carts on a powered track running the length of the gallery. Automated switch junctions every 20 meters. A maintenance gantry running overhead with inspection platforms and cable trays. Constructs here. A rail tech integrated into a switch junction. His torso impaled on the switch lever, legs fused into the actuator housing. Another man overhead, merged with the gantry's cable tray, his spine arched over the tray's edge with his arms dangling into the wiring below. The rail was live. Carts were cycling through on their programmed routes, rolling past on the track with nobody to load or unload them. I began moving through the corridor, timing my steps to the frequency's rhythm. I was learning it now. Roughly 2 minutes of trough. My hands twitched and pulled, but I could control them. 40 seconds of peak, full loss of motor authority in my hands and forearms, partial loss in my shoulders. During peaks, I dropped into a crouch, pressed my hands between my thighs, and waited. During one trough, walking fast between equipment stations, I noticed something wrong. My right hand ignored the corridor walls and the nearest conduit as it drifted toward my left forearm. It was reaching for my suit, specifically the diagnostic port built into the armor plate, a data jack with a live current feed that powered the monitoring system. My fingers kept straining for the port's contact pins. A peak hit. My hands locked against my armor's chest plate. My neck tilted, pulling my head sideways until my left temple pressed against the inside of my helmet, right where the HUD's wiring harness ran behind the visor mount. I could feel the current in the harness through the padding. My temple pressed harder. The muscles in my neck were pulling my skull into the wiring. When the peak passed, I ripped my helmet off and held it at arm's length. My hands were shaking from exertion, not fear. The muscles were fatigued from fighting themselves. I looked at my armor, powered joints at the knees and elbows, running on servo motors fed by the suit battery, diagnostic leads in the forearm plates, the HUD and COM array in the helmet, a battery pack seated in the chest plate's spinal housing. Every one of those systems drew current. Every one of them was mounted against my body. The frequency didn't care whether the current source was on a wall or on my skin. My armor was a live electrical system strapped to my skeleton, and the thing in the rock was trying to fuse me into it. I stood in the ore transport corridor between two constructs and understood that my engineering armor, the only real protection I had in this colony, was going to kill me if I kept wearing it. I started stripping. I removed the forearm plates first, then the chest piece and its battery housing, followed by the powered knee and elbow joints. I piled the components against the corridor wall, shedding the equipment that had defined how I worked for 9 years. The helmet went last. I held it and looked at the HUD display, my comm link to the Harlan, my suit diagnostics, my environmental readouts. Removing it severed contact with my shuttle and cost me both atmosphere monitoring and data. I set it on the pile. I had the unpowered thermal underlayer, thick enough to absorb minor impacts but far short of armor plating, my unpowered boots, the hand-pumped hydraulic cutter, the pry bar, and my hands. I also had the colony's layout, memorized from the schematic during transit because that was how I worked. I always memorized the schematic. The corridor air hit my bare arms and head. The frequency pressed through my joints, its weight shifting with every peak and loosening with every trough. Freed from the helmet's audio filtering, I could feel it more clearly, the way you can feel a bass note in your chest at close range. I looked down the corridor toward the next descent point, the lower galleries and the deep bore shaft. At the bottom waited the geothermal hub, where the frequency was strongest, and every piece of heavy machinery in the colony drew its power. I had to reach it in a thermal underlayer with a manual cutter, while my own nervous system tried to walk me into the nearest live wire. The next peak was already building. I could feel it in my wrists. I picked up the pry bar and started walking. The maintenance ladder in the elevator shaft was bolted to the rock at 1-meter intervals, steel rungs driven into the stone, unpowered, nothing in them that carried current. I climbed down hand over hand through the shaft while the conduit runs on the opposite wall through light across the rock in strips. My pry bar hung from a loop on my belt. The hydraulic cutter was clipped to the back of my underlayer harness. Without the powered joints in my armor, every rung cost me full body weight in my arms and shoulders, and the fatigue from fighting the compulsion through 3 peak cycles had already drained reserve. I wasn't going to get back. The peaks on the ladder were bad. Every rung was steel, and steel conducted the vibration from the rock. When a peak hit, my hands tried to spread flat against the rungs and hold, my fingers reaching toward the bolt anchors where the metal met stone. I hooked my elbows through the rungs, locking my arms at the joint so my hands could claw at empty air while the rest of me hung. Each peak held me for 90 seconds, maybe 100, while every trough felt shorter than the last. Another crest seemed to begin before the previous one had fully let go. I counted rungs. The schematic put the lower mining galleries at roughly 80 meters below the transport level. At 1 rung per meter, 80 rungs. I was at 53 when I heard the drilling. The sounds came from active work, the rhythmic bite and withdraw of a bore drill cutting through new rock, followed by the grinding pitch of a rock saw shaping the cut. A rubble conveyor rattled as it cleared the spoil, while tunnel braces advanced with a deep hydraulic groan, and then the bore drill began again. It was the textbook tunnel extension sequence I had operated on 6 extraction sites. Cut, shape, clear, brace, and advance. I reached the gallery level and stepped off the ladder into a corridor that was wider than the ones above, high enough for a loader to pass through, with rail tracks set into the floor for ore cart traffic. The constructs were denser here. A rail operator fused into a junction switch, legs buried in the actuator pit, his upper body bent backward over the switch housing, with his skull resting against the control relay. Two men integrated into a ventilation assembly mounted to the ceiling, their torsos wrapped around the fan housing, arms threaded through the blade guard. Current arced between contact points on their bodies in small blue-white sparks. I followed the drilling sound. The gallery opened into the active mining face, the forward edge of the colony's tunnel system, where 4 men fused into 4 coordinated machines cut ore from raw asteroid rock. The bore drill operator was first in line. His legs had been driven into the drill's base mounting, his pelvis cracked and spread around the anchor bolts. His arms extended forward into the drill's joystick cradle, hands fused to the controls, wrist bones visible where the skin had burned away at the contact points. The drill was cutting. It punched into the rock face, withdrew, repositioned, and punched again. The man's shoulders rolled with each thrust, his muscles firing in time with the machine's cycle. Behind him, a rock saw operator. This man's torso was threaded through the saw's guide frame, ribs pulled apart and seated around the frame's cross members. His hands gripped the saw's feed lever. The saw followed the bore drill's cuts, shaping and widening them into a clean tunnel profile. Behind the saw, a rubble conveyor operator stretched along the conveyor's length, spine curved to follow the belt's path. Spoil from the cutting face travelled over his body and off the end of the belt into a collection bin, and at the back, a brace operator merged into a hydraulic tunnel brace, a telescoping steel frame that extended from floor to ceiling to support new tunnel sections. The man's arms were inside the brace's hydraulic cylinders, his forearm bones serving as guides for the piston rods. When the cylinders extended, his arms extended with them, pushing the brace into position against the freshly cut rock. They cut, shaped, cleared, braced, and advanced before repeating the cycle. They were extending the mine. The new tunnel drove downward at a 15-degree angle, heading deeper into the asteroid. The walls were clean-cut and properly braced. The work was precise. If I hadn't seen the bodies inside the machines, I would have filed this as competent extraction by a trained crew. I stood at the gallery entrance and watched a full cycle complete itself. The bore drill advanced 18 inches before the rock saw followed, the conveyor cleared the rubble, and the brace pushed forward. The machines had gained another 18 inches toward whatever lay below. The frequency compelled people to fuse with machinery, then directed them into assigned work. Each construct performed its function in the same order a human crew would follow, driving a new tunnel toward the source cavity that the deep bore had breached. The colony's people were using its equipment to expand the mine on behalf of something that had waited in the rock long before Garfield Mineral Corp ever pointed a survey scope at this asteroid. This was a labor protocol, run by a thing that had been doing this, or had been built to do this, for longer than I wanted to think about. A peak hit. My hands shot toward the nearest conduit bracket, fingers reaching for the bolts where copper met steel. I gripped my pry bar with both hands and squeezed until my forearms cramped, fighting the extension in my fingers, giving them something unpowered to hold. The peak ran through me for what felt like 2 minutes. When it released, my hands were stiff and my fingers ached from gripping the bar so hard the crosshatch pattern was stamped into my palms. I moved past the mining face, staying close to the unpowered rock walls, away from the conduit runs and the working constructs. The new tunnel the constructs were cutting intersected with the colony's original deep bore shaft about 40 meters ahead. I could see where the rough-cut walls gave way to the bore shaft's smoother, machine-finished surface. The shaft would take me down to the geothermal hub. I had maybe 90 seconds of trough left. I moved. The deep bore shaft was a vertical cylinder cut through 200 meters of asteroid rock, wide enough to lower heavy equipment on a winch line. The geothermal circulation pipes ran down its center. 4 insulated steel pipes, each a foot in diameter, carrying thermal fluid between the surface heat exchangers and the deep plant. A maintenance ladder zigzagged down the shaft wall in bolted sections, switching sides every 20 meters at small rest platforms. I descended. The vibration was in everything now. Between peaks I could function. During peaks, I lost my hands entirely. My arms would reach for the circulation pipes, for the conduit brackets, for anything that carried current. I hooked my elbows through the ladder rungs and waited, hanging by my arm joints while my hands grasped at nothing and counted until the peak released me. The troughs shrank from a minute and a half to a minute, then less. The peaks grew longer and stronger, overlapping as one began to fade and another crested before my muscles fully unlocked. I was descending into the frequency's source, and every meter deeper compressed the window of control I had left. Near the bottom of the shaft, the bore wall changed. The machine-cut rock gave way to a ragged edge where the drill had broken through into open space. Below the edge, the shaft opened into a vast cavity. I stopped on the last rest platform and looked down. The cavity was roughly spherical. I couldn't see the far side, but the curvature of the near wall suggested a space at least 100 meters across. Its engineered walls were smooth, carved or grown into a repeating pattern of channels, ridges, and concave basins. The channels ran in curving paths across the surface, intersecting at nodes where the basins collected into clusters. The ridges between channels were worn smooth, their edges rounded by geological time, mineral deposits crusted in the deeper grooves. I recognized the principle despite the unknown builders. Acoustic architecture, with channels serving as waveguides and basins as reflectors. The entire cavity was a resonance chamber shaped to receive vibration from above, where the geothermal pumps shook the surrounding rock with every circulation cycle. It focused and tuned that vibration before projecting it upward through the colony's metal infrastructure. The pumps supplied the energy, the cavity shaped it, and the conduits, beams, and steel plating of Prospect 9 carried the result into every room, corridor, and piece of equipment. The structures were ancient, products of an alien engineering tradition absent from every Garfield technical manual and mining industry briefing. Mineral deposits had accumulated in the channels over geological ages. This cavity had been here since before anything with a nervous system walked on Earth. It had lain dormant until the geothermal pumps provided the right vibration source. Its builders and full purpose remained mysteries, but what I could see was enough. It recruited biological organisms into powered machinery and put them to work. Understanding could wait until I killed the pumps. On the rest platform, bolted to the wall beside the ladder, I found the deep bore team's work log. A metal clipboard on a chain, standard procedure on Garfield extraction sites where the bore team recorded depth, rock composition, and operational notes at every shift change. I almost passed it until I saw Lou Kemper's name. The last few entries were written in handwriting that deteriorated as the pages progressed. The final entry, dated 6 days ago, was nearly illegible. Cavity breach at terminal depth. Pumps cycling through new formation. Something wrong with hands. Can't stop reaching for panel. Shutting down this station. Need help. But earlier entries, weeks before the breach, told a different story. Deeper in the bore, the team had logged unusual acoustic anomalies. Vibrations in the rock that diverged from their drill pattern and resonance feedback that interfered with their seismic monitoring equipment. The team lead, a man named Corbett, had filed a formal request to halt drilling and bring in a geological assessment team under standard safety protocol. The response line on the halt request read, "Denied," followed by the initials LK for Lou Kemper, shift supervisor. Below the denial, Corbett had written, "Kemper says we're 3 weeks behind schedule on the thermal gradient target. His quarterly review is tied to bore completion. Proceeding under protest." They kept drilling until they struck the cavity and the pumps activated the resonance chamber, feeding 30 men into their own machines. because Lou Kemper's performance metrics were behind schedule. I stood on the platform and read the log twice. Then I hooked the clipboard back on its chain and looked down into the cavity that Lou's signature had opened. I understood why he'd stayed in his dark locker, why his account had been too clean and his logic too rehearsed, and why he'd hesitated when I asked how strong the frequency was at the bottom. He feared what I would find here more than the descent itself. The job remained the same: kill the hub and remember those initials. I needed evidence, so I unhooked the hydraulic cutter from my harness, set its jaws around one link of the clipboard chain, and worked the manual pump. The link flattened, stretched, and snapped. I clipped the clipboard flat beneath the cutter on my back. Corbett's protest and Lou's denial pressed against my spine as I started down again. The access tunnel to the geothermal hub branched off from the bottom of the bore shaft, a horizontal passage cut through solid rock and lined with heavy-gauge conduit and the 4 main circulation pipes. The pipes were warm to the touch, thermal fluid running through them at pressure, carrying heat from the asteroid's core to the turbines above. I kept my hands away from them during the troughs and wrapped my arms around my own torso during the peaks, hugging myself like a man trying to hold his body together, which was approximately what I was doing. The tunnel ran straight for 60 meters. The vibration was so constant here that the distinction between peak and trough had blurred to a matter of degree. Full loss of motor control versus partial loss of motor control, with no windows of genuine relief. My hands moved on their own unless I was actively fighting them. My fingers twitched and reached and spread toward every piece of metal I passed. I gripped the pry bar in front of me with both hands like a walking stick, arms locked straight, using the bar as a focus point for whatever voluntary muscle control I still had. The tunnel ended at a pressure door held fully open by a hydraulic latch, revealing the geothermal hub beyond. I had seen heavy industrial plants before, working inside turbine halls, pump stations and transformer rooms on a dozen sites across the outer belt. The geothermal hub at the bottom of Prospect 9 was the same kind of space. A large chamber carved from the asteroid's deep rock and filled with machinery that converted thermal energy into electrical power. 4 turbines, each the size of a cargo pod, stood on steel pads along the chamber's centerline. At the far end, pump assemblies connected to circulation pipes that fed thermal fluid from the core. A transformer bank along the right wall stepped up the generator output to transmission voltage. Conduits ran overhead underfoot and along every wall, carrying power upward to the rest of the colony. Every energized system was running, and the air itself seemed to press against me from inside. 5 men from the colony's engineering and maintenance crew had become constructs integrated into the hub's control and operating systems. The first was fused into the primary control console, his hands inside the panel, his forearms sunk to the elbow in the console's wiring cavity. His fingers splayed across the circuit boards that governed the turbine's operating parameters. He was making adjustments, his fused fingers moving on the boards to press contacts and tune the system. 2 more were part of the pump assemblies, bodies wrapped around the pump housings, legs threaded into the suction manifolds, arms pulled into the discharge valves. They were monitoring flow. I could see the minute adjustments in their fused limbs as the pumps cycled, their bodies acting as feedback sensors for the equipment they had become part of. One was inside a transformer housing, visible only as a shape behind the transformer's cooling fins. A human form pressed against the core windings, arms spread along the bus bars, conducting current through his own body. The 5th was on the ceiling. He had climbed into the overhead cable tray and fused himself into the main distribution junction, the central node where the hub's output was split into the conduit runs that fed the colony above. His body was spread across the junction like a patch panel. Current ran through him in visible arcs, jumping between the contact points where his skin met copper. The hub was self-maintaining. The constructs were its operators. They breathed with it. The console operator's chest rose when the turbine governors opened and settled when they closed. The two men in the pumps drew breath on the intake stroke and released it with the discharge, their lungs keeping the machinery's cadence instead of their own. Lou had been right about the biosignals. Whatever remained alive in these men had been made dependent on the work. The man fused into the control panel would override any software command, while his body occupied the physical controls. Pump constructs blocked the turbine shutoffs, and the man on the ceiling embodied the main distribution junction itself. Mechanical force was the only way to break the system. The main circulation manifold was mounted against the back wall, a junction where the 4 circulation pipes converged before feeding the pump assemblies. It was heavy steel and composite, bolted to the wall with anchor pins, flanged and gasketed at each pipe connection. Destroying it would deprive the pumps of fluid input, starve the turbines of thermal energy, and shut down the entire geothermal system. The vibration, the frequency, and the machine cadence governing 30 living bodies would end. I could leave the pumps running and let the constructs extend the mine until they reached whatever the chamber wanted them to reach. Or I could stop the work and discover whether anything human in them could survive the silence. My hydraulic cutter was too small to bite through the reinforced manifold. Mounted on a rail track near the back wall, however, was a piece of equipment I recognized immediately: a pipe maintenance cutter, a heavy, articulated arm with a plasma arc cutting head designed for in-place repairs on the circulation system. It was also powered. The cutting arm drew current from a dedicated feed line. Operating it meant standing in the control cradle, with both hands on the joystick grips, current flowing through the interface contacts, while the frequency hammered me at full intensity at the source. The frequency peaked. My arms flew outward toward the nearest conduit bracket, and my fingers struck the wall-mounted conduit and gripped. Current bit into my fingertips as my skin tightened against the metal, the first instant of fusion. Heat, adhesion, the boundary between flesh and copper beginning to dissolve. I ripped my hands away, leaving skin from 2 fingertips on the conduit and gaining a sharp, clarifying pain. The peak faded. I had seconds. I crossed the chamber to the pipe cutter in a dead sprint, vaulting over a conduit run on the floor, dodging the sweep of a pump construct's fused arm as it cycled through its monitoring routine. The control cradle was a standing rig, a waist-high frame with 2 joystick grips and a trigger assembly for the cutting head. I stepped into the cradle and looked at the grips. The metal handles contained electrically active contacts designed to register the operator's hand position and pressure. Touching them would send current through my palms, allowing the frequency to recognize the contact and begin the integration. I had spent 9 years with my hands on machine controls. Every piece of heavy equipment I had ever operated used the same basic interface: grips, triggers, joystick axes. My hands knew this language better than any other, and the frequency used that knowledge to drive me toward the controls. I needed those same controls to destroy its source. The next peak was building through my wrists, elbows, and shoulder joints, leaving me only seconds. I grabbed the grips. Current hit my palms and ran through my wrists. The cutting arm powered on with a deep mechanical whine, its plasma arc head glowing to operational temperature. Under the frequency's control, my hands locked onto the grips as my fingers fused to the contact surfaces. Electrical heat spread from my palms into my fingertips, tightening the bond between skin and metal. The 2 stripped fingertips met the contacts as open wounds and took the current first, bright points of pain beneath the larger burn. I had seconds before the fusion went past skin and into tendon. I had to use them. The cutting arm swung on its track. Muscle memory carried me. 9 years of joystick operation, thousands of hours of cutting, shaping, levering heavy equipment through precise arcs. Thought dropped away as I drove the arm. The plasma arc head swung toward the circulation manifold, and I hit the trigger with the heel of my right hand. because my fingers were already locked to the grip and couldn't move independently. When the cutting head struck the manifold, plasma sliced through the steel and released scalding thermal brine in a pressurized white plume across the chamber wall. The first jet missed me because the cut faced sideways. It struck the rock hard enough to throw mineral chips across the chamber, then atomized into steam. Heat rolled over the cradle. I turned my head and pressed my mouth into my shoulder, but my hands kept me fixed in place. Condensate hit the bare skin at the back of my neck, hot enough to raise blisters before it ran under the collar of my thermal layer. The console operator reacted. His fused fingers moved in a fast sequence across the boards. Both pump constructs convulsed around their housings, arms rotating inside the discharge valves. The pumps climbed in pitch. They were compensating for lost pressure, increasing flow through a manifold that was already open. The plume thickened. A valve shifted, sweeping the jet away from the wall, across the cutter rail, and toward the control cradle. I drove the articulated arm between myself and the rupture. Brine hammered the steel housing and broke around it in sheets. The cutter absorbed the force while the heat passed through. Fluid splashed over the cradle base and around my boots, and after resisting the first contact, the thermal layer yielded enough for heat to reach my shins. I swung the arm again and drove the cut deeper until the manifold buckled and metal screamed beneath the plasma arc, severing the second pipe connection. The force of the release kicked the cutter head sideways and sent my boot slipping in the fluid until my full weight dropped through my fused hands. Skin pulled against metal, the bond tightening instead of tearing, and both shoulders slammed into the front of the cradle. I got one boot against the rail and pushed myself upright. Steam had erased the back wall. I could see the manifold only as a dark shape inside it. The pump stuttered, then the console operator found another contact. One pump caught and drove against the falling pressure. A construct's fused arm pulled through the full arc of its valve housing, using his shoulder joint as part of the actuator. The remaining pipes shuddered in their wall brackets. The system was trying to preserve itself with the same trained corrections I would have made at a failing plant. I followed the vibration through the cutter arm because I could no longer see the target. The rail, the angle of the first two cuts, the resistance in the joystick, those were enough. I drove the plasma head into the place where the main junction body had to be. I hit the manifold a third time, driving the cutting head through the main junction body until the entire assembly split apart and severed all four pipes. The circulation system vomited its remaining fluid across the floor in a spreading flood of hot brine. The turbines wound down as the pumps coughed, seized, and sent the overhead lights through a final surge before darkness. The frequency, the thing that had pulled at my skeleton since I entered the colony, faltered and decayed through diminishing waves, each weaker than the last, like a struck bell dying through its harmonics. The compulsion gradually loosened its hold on my muscles and released them. My hands remained fixed. I looked down. My palms were fused to the joystick grips. The skin had melted shallowly into the contact surfaces, yet bonded deeply enough to resist pulling. Electrical burns covered both palms and the insides of my fingers in a mottled pattern of white and red. I could feel the grips as part of my hands and my heartbeat inside the contact points. The chamber was dark, lit only by emergency chemical strips that cast a dim green wash across the floor. Constructs and machines had stopped together. Steam drifted through the light while hot fluid drained into the floor channels, leaving a total and immense silence beneath the hiss. I wedged the pry bar under my right palm, braced its tip against the joystick housing, and levered. The pain was extraordinary and specific. Skin tore from metal it had become part of as the seam between me and the machine ripped open under force. My right hand came away with a wet, fibrous sound, leaving skin and tissue on the contact surface. The freed palm was raw, burned, and incomplete, a hand-shaped wound that would never quite close right. I did the left hand, working the lever with my forearm, because the injured right could no longer grip the bar. The left palm tore free with the same sound and cost. I stepped back from the control cradle and held both hands in front of me. The biological reality of major tissue damage shook them as blood ran down my wrists and dripped from my fingertips. I tore strips from my thermal underlayer and wrapped both hands, winding the fabric tight enough to apply pressure, loose enough that I could still close my fingers around the pry bar if I needed to. The wrapping soaked through before I finished tying it. The constructs in the hub were motionless. The man at the control console had his arms buried in the panel, his fused fingers inert. The pump operators hung in their housings. The man on the ceiling was dark, his contact points empty of current. Life remained in the shallow rhythm of chests moving inside bodies permanently joined to silent machines. The rhythm was already breaking. The console operator drew 3 short breaths, waited too long, then managed another. One of the pump operators tried to inhale while his chest was cinched against the silent housing. Nothing in the machine moved to make room for him. I went to the console operator. A service panel beside his left arm stood open far enough to take the end of the pry bar. I hooked it under the edge and leaned with my forearms. The panel moved less than an inch, taking his shoulder with it. Under the cover, insulated wire, burn tissue, and the branching bones of his hand continued through the same packed channels. Machine and man shared an unbroken structure that made dismantling one fatal to the other. He stopped breathing while I was looking for one. The structural fusion placed them beyond anyone's help. Bones threaded through housings, organs displaced around drive shafts, spines curved to follow mechanical assemblies. Removing them would mean dismantling the machines around them, and even then the tissue damage was beyond anything a surgical team could reverse. They were going to die here in the dark, fused to equipment that had lost its reason to hold them. I picked up my pry bar, my cutter, and I walked out. The ascent was long and dark. Glow strips marked the path at intervals, every 10 meters along the bore shaft, every junction in the corridors above. I climbed the maintenance ladder with my wrapped hands screaming at every rung, forearms doing the work my palms couldn't. On the first section, my right hand wrapping slid against the steel and opened the wound beneath it. My fingers released without warning, and I dropped the length of one rung before my left elbow caught. After that, I looped both forearms over each rung, lifted my weight, and advanced one boot at a time. The clipboard struck my back with every movement, Corbett's record still clipped beneath the cutter. I passed through the mining galleries, where the coordinated constructs hung motionless in their machines, the bore drill frozen mid-cut, and the rock saw stalled in its guide frame. In the ore transport corridor, I left my piled armor where it lay. My injured hands could no longer fasten its seals, making it useless to me. I continued through the processing level and past its gallery of crushers, conveyors, and chemical tanks, all dark and silent around their dead operators. I reached Lou's corridor, where the cut power lines led to the equipment locker at the end of the hall. I stopped at the door. The grid's death had taken the atmosphere recyclers and heating system with it, leaving Prospect 9 to bleed its remaining warmth and oxygen into the rock. Lou had a suit air tank in there, with perhaps a few hours of breathing left. Abandoned in the locker, he would die. Aboard the Harlan, he would reach the nearest crewed station and face the inquest along with the families of the crew he had sent past Corbett's warning. I thought about Corbett's handwriting in the bore log. Proceeding under protest. I thought about LK scrawled next to the denial. I opened the door. Lou was on his feet. He'd heard me coming. My boots on the rock floor, the only sound in a dead colony. He took in my hands wrapped in bloody fabric, the darkness behind me, and finally the metal clipboard strapped beneath the cutter on my back. His gaze stopped there. The entire grid is down. including life support, I said. We need to move. His eyes stayed on the clipboard. You brought the log. Corbett left it. Lou tightened the bandage around his shortened hand. Dan, listen. You're getting on my shuttle. At the station, you're going to explain why he asked for a geological team and why you made him keep drilling. He looked past me into the dark. Whatever answer he had prepared remained where it was. Lou kept his questions about the bore log and what I'd seen at the bottom to himself as he followed me down the corridor and up through the colony to the surface docking bay. I let him walk behind me, postponing judgment until we were away from 30 men cooling in their machines below us. At the manual hatches, I stood clear while Lou worked the latches with his left hand. The one-handed work slowed our progress. Between doors, he carried the suit tank tucked under his shortened right arm. The Harlan was where I'd left it, with docking clamps sealed, cabin pressurized, and batteries at full charge. I secured Corbett's log against the console, where Lou could see it from the passenger seat, then dropped into the pilot seat and took the controls. The throttle grip pressed against the wrapping on my right palm, bringing white, immediate pain. I held on because this was the last machine I would operate, and I would do it with whatever I had left. The docking clamps released, and the shuttle's maneuvering thrusters fired as Prospect 9 fell away below us, a dark, irregular rock whose silence concealed the men cooling inside it. Beside me, Lou sat wordless in the passenger seat. I pushed the throttle forward and the Harlan accelerated away from the asteroid. My hands ached against the controls through soaked wrapping, and I could feel the rawness where my palms used to be, where the contact surfaces of a machine's joystick grips had taken what they could before I tore myself free. The precision that had made me worth the solo contract rate was gone from every cutter, drill rig, loader arm, or rescue crane I might touch. Whatever remained under those bandages belonged to a man who had operated a machine one last time and left part of himself on its controls. The transit corridor to the nearest crude station lay ahead, while behind us drifted an asteroid with an ancient chamber in its core, dormant again, its resonance stilled and its recruited workers quiet in the dark. It waited as it had before for the next pumps, the next hands, and the next crew foolish or unlucky enough to drill into what should have remained buried. Lou would answer to the board, the inquest, Corbett's family, and the other 29 families.